The China Story at your fingertips. 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 The China Story at your fingertips.
Well, first, we want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us. So there have been increases in the projected GDP growth rate for this year. Morgan Stanley recently increased their projections from 5 to, I think, 5.4%. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, went up to 5.3 from 4.4. What are your thoughts on those changes? Do you agree with them? What in your mind has led to those alterations in predictions?
It's my great pleasure to be here. I think 2023 is a good year for the Chinese economy. So I think the economic growth from the demand side, we'll see a strong recovery in consumption and investment. But the contribution of export to the economy will be limited in this year because the world economy is not very good for this year. From the supply side or from the perspective of productivity growth, I think China still have big potential for productivity growth in agriculture sector, manufacturing sector, and in service. In the past decade, you see the Chinese economy's growth rate is declining. The productivity growth is declining. But I would say to a large extent, this kind of slowing down of the growth rate can contribute to the change of economic development stage. If you look at the same development stage, let's say in Japan in 1970s, in European economies in 1970s and 80s, and in Korea in 1990s, you will see very similar pattern, very similar change of the productivity. So if you compare China's productivity changes with those kind of high economy, you will find that China is still on the track on catching up. So even though the productivity growth is not as high as it was before, but I think it still have plenty of room to make productivity growth.
And you mentioned consumption and investment, and I think we'll get to that. But I was curious also, what in your mind do you think will be the major growth drivers for this year? What sectors of the economy will be picking back up? You did mention on the demand side, obviously there's a lot of pent-up demand, a lot of savings waiting to be kind of unleashed as spending. So what sectors do you see as being taking in the bulk of that, or what do you see as the main motivators for China's growth?
I think the major contribution will come from consumption. Before the pandemic, for each individual, when they get 100 yuan disposable income, they will spend something like 67 yuan. But in the pandemic period, let's say in 2022, when people get 100 yuan, they only spend 61 yuan. So you see a very big change. So, in this year, we have a relaxation of the pandemic policies. The economy is in the process of recovery. So I think people's consumption for given income will be increased. Let's say if it comes from 61 to 64, not come to its pre-pandemic number, the consumption growth rate will come to something like 4%. By this one factor, it come to 4%. At the same time, we'll see that the income growth for this year, based on our estimation, is something like 7%. That's the reason I say that the major contribution will come from consumption. In addition to consumption, the investment, especially the real estate sector investment, will see some recovery for this year. I think there are four. Last year, the real estate sector have a very big drop. But for this year, we can see some positive factors. Number one, the relaxation of pandemic policies. This is the good news for overall economy. Same for it's good for the real estate sector. Number two, you have a more favorable financial policies, not only to the developer, but also to the people who want to use mortgage to buy a new house. So a more favorable financial policy. This is the second one. The third one is the inventory of the housing. In the housing market, the inventory is low, it's not very high. And the fourth one, maybe the most important one, as for the contribution to real estate investment, I think it's a lot. There are a lot of unfinished housing in last year, and for this year, you have a more favorable financial condition. You have enough cash flows. You have to finish this kind of project. So this will be a very big contribution to the investment in real estate sector. So in combining all those factors together, I think we will have a significant recovery in the real estate sector.
Yeah, so mentioning the real estate sector, I wondered if you can go into some more detail about what the situation was, what it is now, and then when you mentioned some of the more favorable policies, there's interest in how that's going to shake out. So if you wouldn't mind kind of giving us an overview of kind of the fact, like what was involved in the situation there, and what are some of the measures that are being discussed or that have already been implemented to kind of resolve this?
I think for this year, the policy will be more supportive to the real estate sectors. As for the mortgage rate, for the lendings to the developers, all those kind of policy will be supportive. In addition to that, I think China may need some kind of policy-oriented institute to help the market. I think the recovery of real estate sector is very, very important for the economy. You know, if you want to have a stabilized macroeconomy, you must have a stable real estate market. So I have mentioned the favorable changes will happen in this year, but at the same time, we have to be. We cannot expect too much. As for the real estate sector has changed a lot. You know, it's very different than it was in 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So if you look at the demand side, I think the overall demand for new housing is declining. Because we have, our urbanization process will be slowing down, and we have our population and demographic changes. We do not need so much housing as it was before. This is the demand side. If you look at the supply side, the developer need several years to do merge and acquisition, to reconstruct their balance sheet. So they need several years to do this kind of jobs. So that's the reason I will say there will be recovery in the real estate sector, but you cannot expect too much. We still need more supportive policies to help the market to be stabilized.
And another concern, somewhat related, is the cost, the price, home buyer. How do you balance those two interests, right? How do you make sure the market is stable at the same time making sure people don't get priced out of affordable homes?
I think the housing price is too high. So if you look at China's big cities, you will find that the housing price is very high in the central area. It's still very high in the urban area. In the suburb area. If you compare China's big cities with the big cities in, let's say, New York, in London, or in Tokyo, you will see in the central area, the housing price is very, very high. It's not affordable to most people. But in the suburb area, let's say in London or in other big cities, I think in the suburb area, the housing price is not that high. For, let's say, middle class, it's affordable to them. So if you look at China, in the suburb area, I think the housing price is not affordable to most people. Not most people, to a lot of people. I think this is too high. So we have to work it out. We have to find some ways to help those people who want to work or live in the big cities in China. I think to lower the housing price in China's suburb area is a key issue. I think for the high housing price in the central area, I do not think we have too much room to change it. But for the high housing price in the suburb area, I think we do have a lot of rooms to change it. If we have a cheaper land price, if we can increase our provision of land, we can have a cheaper housing price in the suburb area. And by doing this, we can have more constructions of new housing. It's good for the investment in the real estate sectors. It's good for the economy. It's a good thing to providing more housing for those kind of migrant workers or middle or low income families. I think it's good, not only for the macroeconomic stability, but also for the welfare improving for the ordinary people. So I do not think they contradict with each other. They help each other. You have a cheaper housing price in the urban area. We still have room to make changes.
And going back to consumption, I wanted to talk a little bit about, we talked about demand and leading consumption driving growth, but in terms of consumption's proportion in the overall economy, I wondered what the long-term outlook might be for that, because we've seen from some commentators, some economists have said that it's better in the long term if China moves toward a more consumption-oriented economy as opposed to an investment-oriented economy or an export economy, what have you. So what are your thoughts on that? And if that is the case, how does that movement happen?
If we look at the experience of Japan, Korea, and European economies, you will see the same pattern. When the GDP per capita increase, let's say it's above 10,000 US dollar, you will see the declining share of investment in GDP and increasing share of consumption in GDP. I think in generally, the China follow the same pattern. In the past decade, the share of consumption in GDP has increased from 50% to 55%. So the share of consumption in GDP has been increased in the past decade. But in the pandemic period, things are a little different. But I think after the pandemic, if we go back to normal economic life, I think the share of consumption will continue to increase. And if the GDP per capita continue to increase, the share of consumption to GDP will increase. I cannot give you a very exact number, but I think it will increase.
Despite moving into more advanced levels of economic output and moving up the value chain, so to speak, China is still maintaining a healthy proportion of its activity in those sectors, in those, the so-called real economy, the building of real things, the producing of real goods. Is there a reason for that, or what are the fundamental principles behind continuing to shore that up and continuing to maintain those levels of activity in those areas?
First, I don't know I don't know we have a very clear definition of real economy.
Sure.
Maybe let's say I think for me, tangible and intangible is more easy to understand. I think for the agricultural sectors, for the industrial sector, especially the manufacturing sector, a lot of people will say they are the real economy or the tangible sector. But for service, let's say some financial sector, some business service sector, they are not that real. Maybe they belong to the intangible sector. So, if we do not give too much attention on this kind of classification, intangible or tangible, or, or real or not real, I think all those kind of economic sectors, they interact with each other. Let's say, if you do not have a modern industrial sector, you will not have a modern agriculture sector. If you do not have well-designed, let's say, IP production, financial service, many other business service, and research, all of these kind of are services. If you do not have this kind of services, you cannot expect continued upgrading of your industrial sector. So all those sectors, I think they interact with each other, they help with each other. But for very specific period, people will give more attention for the development of industrial sector. The reason is there are bigger potential for the productivity growth in the industrial sector when your industrial sector is far from the frontier. If you are already in the frontier, not not very big potential to make productivity growth. But if you're not that close to the frontier, you can learn a lot from the frontier. I mean, you can make a lot of productivity growth, more easy to learn from outside. So that's the reason I think for some specific period, people will give a lot of emphasis for the development on the manufacturing sector, which I think is right. But after that, this specific period, I think we need a more balanced growth among economic sectors. I do not want to say which sector is more important. Yes, I think all economic sectors are important. We need all of them.
So moving to monetary policy, we've been seeing the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Fed has been raising the interest rates for quite some time now. So with that pattern, what is China's perspective, or what is China's own kind of response in terms of its monetary policy and its central bank? How do these changes, which happen on a country level but which have an enormous amount of influence on the rest of the world, how do they affect China in particular?
That's a very professional question. If you look at the Fed, when Fed raise their interest rate, it affects the whole world. But the impact is different. Let's say for European economies, for Japan, even if the Fed raise their interest rate, it will have some impact for them. But in generally, their financial market is okay. Their macroeconomic stability is okay. They can still keep the macroeconomic stability. Will have some impact for them, but it's rather limited. But for many emerging economies, when Fed raise their rate, it will be very challenging. Sometimes you will see a very big capital outflows. You will see big pressures for the domestic market. I think the different reaction or different impact based on two issues, two things. One is, do you have a flexible exchange rate regime? If your exchange rate regime is flexible, the impact of the interest rate change will be offset by the adjustment of exchange rate. So The other factor is domestic economic fundamentals. If your economic fundamental is very good, even though you have some kind of shocks, like the interest rate hike in the United States, the impact on you is rather limited if your domestic fundamental is okay. But if your domestic economy is very vulnerable, it's not that good. When you have this shock from the United States, it will have a very big impact. So there will be very big changes in the domestic economy. So let's look back to China. In the past decade, China tried to establish a more flexible exchange regime. So in the past 5 years, China basically quit the intervention in the foreign exchange market. The RMB exchange rate regime now is a more flexible exchange rate regime. It's determined by the market, by the demand and supply side. At the same time, if you look at the economic fundamentals, China do not have inflation pressure. The economic growth rate, at least for this year, I think we are in the year of recovery. It's okay. So even if the United States make interest rate hike, I think the impact on the Chinese economy is rather limited. And for the monetary authority in China, it's manageable. And if we look at the past experience, for the determination of China's capital flows, basically you have two kind of factors. One is the external factors, like the interest rate hike in other countries. Another one is domestic factors, economic fundamentals in China. If you look at the empirical studies, you will see that the domestic factors determined the capital flows in China, rather than the external factors determine the capital flows in China. So based on this kind of research, I think the Chinese monetary authority will be more independent. They will give more emphasis on the domestic economic objectives.
And so, I guess then, just to follow up briefly, so in focusing on the domestic fundamentals and the domestic objectives, what does central bank do? Even if the direct impact of the raising of interest rates is not quite so substantial. Yeah. Let's say in a recovery year like this, or in a growth year that we're expecting to see, what would monetary policy be expected to look like?
Okay. Let me give you an example. When United States raise their interest rate, as for China, you have two choices. One is the Fed raise their interest rate, you have an increasing gap of interest rate. You should follow. That's the choice of many other countries. You should follow the interest hike in the United States. That's one choice. By doing this, you may reduce your pressure of capital outflows, stabilize the exchange rate. This is the first choice. The second choice is that the monetary authorities say, our economy is not that strong, we need more demand, we need to cut the interest rate rather than raise the interest rate. But by cutting the interest rate, you will have a bigger gap, interest rate gap between China and the United States. You may have bigger pressure for capital flows and exchange rate. So how do you make the choice? Based on what I said, the domestic factor is more important in determining the capital flows in China. So China should choose number two. China should cut the interest rate rather than raise the interest rate, because even if you cut the interest rate, if it's helpful for your domestic economic fundamentals, it can be helpful to stabilizing the capital flows, even though the interest rate gap is bigger, even though the Fed raise their interest rate.
And so finally, as you, I believe, are a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, and so you're getting ready for that as well. I guess, what are your expectations in the context of what we've discussed in terms of what's going to come out of the two sessions this year? Are there proposals you are planning to make, or are there proposals you hope to see? What is your perspective on that and your outlook on that?
I think this conference covers a lot of issues, a lot of topics. So for this year, I think people will give more emphasis for the recovery of the economy, to create more jobs, to improve people's living welfare. I think this will be very key issue in this year. I will give a proposal on the to establish policy-oriented financial institutions to help the migrant worker and low-income families, to help them to have to finance their housing. And we have two big challenges in China's real estate sector now. The first one is there are still a big number of migrant workers. They work in the big cities, but the housing for them is still not affordable for them. And we have talked, the housing price in the suburb area is too high. I think this is the first challenge in China's housing real estate sector. The second is the developers. They are confronted with very big pressures in the coming years. They need to do a lot of merge and acquisition. They need to do a lot of deleverage. So this process could be very long, and it will give a lot of pressure to the macroeconomic stability. So China needs to deal with those two challenges. I think a policy-oriented financial institution can do some help. They can do some kind of merge and acquisition. They can buy some kind of properties in the market, and they can do some restructuring and give this kind of give those housings to the migrant workers or lower income families by a cheaper price. So it's not only help the real estate sector, it's also very helpful for the macroeconomic stability.